Hello and welcome to the Reviews Brothers. Platform games were the big thing in the 16-bit era, and while Mario and Sonic did tend to reign supreme, there were a ton of other titles desperately trying to get in on the action, often offering bright, colourful graphics, crazy characters and exotic levels that took you all across all sorts of wacky places. It's no surprise that many of these games went under the radar for a lot of people. So, in this video, we're going to take a look at some of the 16-bit platform games that don't get talked about as much as your blue spiky plumbers do, though some of them really should not be talked about all that much. Anyway, how about I shut up, you press that subscribe button, and we take a look at some games. We're going to start on the Mega Drive, or Genesis if that's how you choose to live your life, with Chiki Boys, an action platform that is a port of an arcade game. It's also known as Mega Twins if you have the non-Japanese version. Here you control one of two twins who are on a mission to get their world back after it's been attacked and taken over by some monsters that decide to show up. Bastards. So you set out across 9 worlds, battling a load of diabolical bastards and eventually fighting a boss at the end of each stage. You can choose to play as either of the Chiki boys, and for the most part they play the same. Only the blue one does more damage with his sword, and the red one is better with magic. I'm a sword person myself, so stuck with him. The levels are all fairly short, but there's a lot packed in them. Enemies are constantly coming at you from pretty much all angles, and most levels introduce their own enemy types, which is pretty cool. None of them are that hard to defeat, thanks to the fact that your attacks are generally pretty good, and you've got a decent speed and range. In fact, most of the time I took damage, it was mainly down to the fact that enemies were placed in awkward positions that made it hard to get to them without taking damage, or just from the fact that there's the sheer number of them coming at you from all angles is crazy. But that's where your magic comes in. You've got a few uses per level, and it clears the screen for the most part, but all the text is in Japanese, so I'm not exactly sure what they're called. When you kill enemies, they'll drop money, and you'll find a lot of chests that also contain money, as well as health or magic power-ups. And make sure you do collect this money. After each level, you go to a shop where you can buy health, power up your weapons, buy magic, and even an extra continue. I kinda like how this works. It basically means you have one continue per level, and then you buy a new one at the end of that level. And to be honest, that's really all you need. And more importantly, with your continue, you actually start exactly where you die, which is just awesome. Graphically, the game looks great with big colourful sprites and excellent animation. There's a load of enemies, and although some of the bosses are used multiple times, they are all fun to fight. The controls are solid, and you can even wall jump, which comes in really handy. Overall, this is a very solid game for the Mega Drive or Genesis. I don't really hear it get talked about a lot, but it is definitely worth playing. Plok for the Super Nintendo is a game that me and a lot of my friends used to own, but not many people seem to know about it. It is of course a platform game where you play as Plok, a strange yellow and red thing. He wakes up one day to see that his flag that's outside his house has been stolen. Outraged, he sets off to find it, travelling through dozens of levels trying to track it down. And that's basically the story, you gotta get your flag back. Each level is packed with tricky platforming, and this is not an easy game, which surprises most people as it looks so nice and bright and colourful. There's shells on all the levels that you need to collect, get enough of these and you'll get an extra life, and there's also a ton of enemies all over the place. To defend yourself, Plok shoots his arms and legs at enemies, like literally. They act as boomerangs, so will come back to you, but you have to be careful, as if you shoot them all in one go, you'll be defenceless until one of them comes back. You can still move and jump though, and it's all quite funny. In fact, the game does have a decent sense of humour, with Plok just being a grumpy bloke that's fed up about having to even leave his house, let alone get his stuff back. After every few levels you have a boss fight, which is nice. These are actually really fun to play, and they get quite tough too. In fact, many of the later levels, and even a few of the early ones, are very hard, requiring precise timing to land on platforms and enemies taking a lot of hits. Something to note is that you have a dedicated high jump button. When you do a high jump, you're defenseless, but you can leap large distances. You'll need to use this a lot, but timing is everything. Graphically, the game is excellent, with an almost crayon-like look to it, but it looks great, and you can collect various power-ups in the levels that give Plok new abilities, like boxing gloves or becoming a fireman. These all look good, and the music even changes to fit your costume. There's a lot going on in the levels, and the variety in enemies and bosses is great. As mentioned, the controls are spot on, and this is one of those games where if you mess up, it's on you. Overall, this is a great platform game, though don't be fooled by its cute graphics, it's not an easy ride. Back to the Mega Drive now for Kid Chameleon. Now this is probably the most well-known game in this video, as it is actually included on pretty much all of Sega's compilations, and generally it's for good reason. Here you play as your typical 90s kid with chewed. He's been sucked into a virtual world and has to explore about 100 levels, fighting monsters and using various power-ups that transform him and give him new abilities in order to escape. This is a cool premise, and I actually really like playing this game, even though I don't think it's one that I'll ever finish. Before transforming, you'll be running around hitting blocks Mario style. These contain gems, which of course when you get enough will give you an extra life. You can also find health and extra time, and more importantly, helmets, which you use to transform into your various forms. And this is where it gets fun. There's 10 or so different helmets, each one being introduced at various parts of the game, and you have one that makes you into a knight thing, and for some reason this gives you the ability to climb walls. Then there's a demon skull that gives you a horned head where you can run through certain blocks and walls, as well as killing enemies. Then there's a samurai one that gives you a sword slash, and there's one that's basically Jason from Friday the 13th, where you have unlimited throwing axes, and a load more. What's cool is that the later levels use a combination of the helmets to open different paths and routes throughout the levels. It's a nice touch to see that none of them are forgotten about, but you'll definitely have your favourites. When you do have a helmet, you can take 3 hits, and thankfully you don't die after this. Instead, you just turn back into a regular punk kid, where you can also take another 3 hits. You're not defenceless though, as you can still jump on most enemies to defeat them. Something that plays a big part in the gameplay here is momentum. You'll need to build up speed to make most jumps and reach higher ledges, or just to smash through things with your various mask powers. This can sometimes make the controls feel a bit sluggish and slippery, but for the most part it does control well. But there were times when I would take damage because I'd over or undershoot a jump and land on an enemy or spikes. Something else that's a bit annoying is that it is possible to get stuck in a lot of the levels if you don't have the correct power, or if you make a platform disappear that you needed. This is never welcome, especially later on. Now you do have the option to restart the level in the pause menu, but it will cost you a life, so it does mean that there's trial and error involved. Though the biggest issue with the game, and the reason I'll likely never finish it, is the fact that there are 103 levels, which is great, but there's no save or password feature, so you're forced to go through the whole thing every time you load it up. Now, granted, thanks to the new compilations, you are able to do save states, but still, if you're a purist, it is a big ask to go through the whole thing in one go. Other than that though, this is a really fun game. It's by no means the best on the system, but it's got some cool ideas, fun levels, and will definitely keep you entertained. Pop and Twinbee Rainbow Bell Adventures for the Super Nintendo is one that I never hear anyone talk about, and that's crazy because it's an awesome game. It's a spin-off from the shooter series of the same name, and you have to rescue a space princess who has of course been captured. So you get to choose from one of 3 characters, Twinbee, Winbee and Gwynbee, each of which play slightly differently from one another, with different speed, jump stats and attacks, but each of them has their benefits. There's loads of levels here, and the levels themselves are all pretty large, but what's cool is that they play vertically as well as horizontally, and as you're a spaceship thing, you have a jump boost that you can do by holding the jump button to build a meter. When it's full, release it and you'll boost into the air. You'll need to use this to reach higher parts of the levels, or you can use it to go left and right at high speeds. You also take out most enemies at the same time when using it, and it's so fun to use. As well as this, you can bounce off around the scenery, and will often need to do this to reach new areas. It's loads of fun to play around with. There's bells on each level, and you're told how many there are to collect, but I'll be honest though, I never really noticed what these were actually for, as you already got unlimited lives. Also, when you defeat enemies, they drop big bells of various colours. These are your power-ups, and they'll give you new weapons to use, or things like being able to move faster or make you invincible, so you'll want to kill as many enemies as you can. You can do this by jumping on them, or you can punch them, or rocket boost into them, or you can even charge up an attack to splat them with. Later you'll get guns and bombs to use, and there's just so much to do here. Graphically, the game looks awesome with some nice bright characters and levels, and it all runs fast and super smooth with cool boss fights every few levels. What I like here is that when you die, you can actually change character, which is handy for 2 reasons, as sometimes you'll want to choose a different character that maybe is weaker but takes less time to charge up their jump boost, as there's loads of chasms to get over, or sometimes you want the stronger one as there's more enemies but not as many jumps. I also like it because it means I can record footage of all characters without having to restart the game. What's also cool here is that you have a map that you can bring up at any time that shows you where the exit is, as well as any key items, like keys, that you might need, though it doesn't show you exactly how to get to them, so you'll still need to do a lot of exploring, which is always loads of fun to do. The biggest downside to it though is that there are no save or passwords here, so you do have to play through it in one go. This is really the only downside to it though, as otherwise everything else is fantastic. I'd say this is a must play. Here is Flink for the Mega Drive. This action platform game puts you in the control of Flink, a little magician kid who has to stop an evil wizard that has doused the land in a nasty black cloud. So you set out across the land getting rid of evil black clouds and the evil wizard's minions one level at a time. Now this is actually a really interesting game that has some really cool mechanics to it, and while I could have done with a bit of polish, it is still a lot of fun. Most of the levels see you exploring a pretty large area where your main objective is just to get to the end, but it's never that simple. There's loads of enemies as well as puzzle elements for you to watch out for, as well as some pretty tough platforming in areas. To defeat enemies you can jump on their heads. Normally if you do this they're stunned, at which point you can grab them and then spin them at other enemies. This is great for taking out a few at once. Enemies will drop magic that you need to collect, and you'll also need to find chests that have items and magic in them, and there's certain enemies with backpacks that also contain items. You want to get as many of these as possible, as they're actually ingredients for various spells that you'll learn as you play. There's a few spells that will affect you, as well as some that affect the world around you, like making plants grow super big so you can use them as platforms to reach new areas. Now what's nice is that you don't ever need to use these things, as often you won't have enough items to make the spells, but when you are able to, you'll find an easier route with less enemies, or sometimes hidden areas with extra power-ups or ingredients. This is a really nice touch. To make the spells, you go into the pause menu, where you can see a list of the ones you've discovered, and you can choose the ingredients and you have to put them in the exact order displayed. Now, I'm not sure if you can make spells of things that you haven't discovered, even if you do have the right ingredients, as I did try a few random combinations, but nothing ever seemed to work. Graphically, the game is fantastic, and it's probably one of the best looking games on the system. Everything is packed with detail and the animation on everything is great. In fact, a lot of the people that worked on this went on to do the Adventures of Lomax for the PS1, and you can really see that in the look and design of just about everything here. The controls are good, but probably the weakest part of the game, mainly because Flink moves quite slowly and takes a while to build up momentum, often making precise jumping very difficult. But you do get used to it. You get a few lives and continues too, but again there's no passwords here. Something else I don't like is the music, which I thought was just terrible and really grates on your ears. There are CD versions of this game though, which might be a lot better. This is still a fun, unique game that is a decent mix of platforming and puzzles. Rocky Rodent for the Super Nintendo is prime Chewed era gaming. You are Rocky Rodent, a cool rodent thing who is famous for eating at restaurants and not paying. One day after doing a dine and dash, you get mixed up in a kidnapping where the restaurant's daughter is taken as he hasn't paid his protection money. And yes, this really is the story. The owner then says you can have all the free food you want if you get her back. So you do. So you do your best Sonic impression and run pretty fast through a bunch of levels, trying to track down the restaurant owner's daughter. The main gimmick here is all about hair for some reason. You find a few different hair products and each one gives you a different hairstyle, and therefore a different special ability. You get a mohawk that you can use as a spike to kill enemies, as well as being able to stick to certain walls and swing yourself onto higher platforms. Or you might get the other mohawk that you can actually throw like a boomerang to kill enemies, or it sticks in walls and lets you bounce off it. It's actually pretty cool, and I like these mechanics. As you'd expect, levels are designed to need a combination of hairstyles to get through them, and it can actually be quite hard to find your way through some of the levels. And yep, there's plenty of enemies everywhere too. These can either be jumped on to beat them, or just whip your hair back and forth. Both methods are pretty effective, and the game is generous with the collision detection. Interestingly, other than hair stuff, there's no other things for you to collect. Well, I guess there's food for points. But this is a very unusual thing for a platform game, and I thought there'd be more to get. You do get boss fights here though, and these are really cool. And the cutscenes are actually pretty fun too, and the game really doesn't take itself seriously. The graphics are excellent, and I do really like how everything looks and animates. Thankfully, the controls are decent too, and Rocky is pretty damn fast when there's room for him to get to full speed. This can make it hard to avoid enemies, but it really isn't all that much of a problem. This isn't the most challenging game once you get used to it, but it was one that I did find myself getting engrossed in and really enjoying my time with it. This is another one that I'm actually kind of surprised you don't hear too much about, as it is solid in just about every way, but the generic name probably didn't do it any favours, and it probably got lost in the mountain of other mascot platform games, but it really isn't one that you should ignore. Next for the Mega Drive is Greendog, the beach surfer dude, and yes, that is how it's pronounced, just ask Joe from GameSack. Greendog is in fact a beached surfer dude who finds a cool looking necklace that turns out to be cursed, so he can't take it off. Of course, this means you have to platform your way through various exotic locations, defeating all the wildlife that now wants to kill you, and killing bosses, so you can get rid of the curse, and hopefully impress the sexy bikini woman who somehow knew all about the curse in the first place, but didn't bother to warn you. Now, the thing is that this is a game that everyone really seems to hate, but you know what, I actually kinda like it. Every level sees you needing to get to the end using your unlimited supply of boomerang frisbee things to kill the hundreds of fish, birds, crabs, rock things and other animals that want you dead. You'll also be doing a lot of platforming, which is kinda clunky, but not that bad really. After every few levels you get to ride a pedal copter to get to a new area. These levels aren't that fun though, to be honest, and they're more like a bonus level, and you just have to kill the enemies and grab the food that they drop with your stupid weird punch thing. Food here is mainly for points, but you will get health back from some of it too. In some levels you meet a cute dog, who at first I thought was pretty cool, but then I realised that he steals all the food if you don't get to it first, so he's actually a bit of a dick. But he is a dog, so I'll forgive him. For me, the most annoying mechanic are the levels where you get sent back to the start of the stage, like this underwater one, where if you get caught by fishermen, you do go back to the start of the stage and lose a life. That sucks, and in fact was the only time I did actually lose a life that I can think about it. It is a pretty easy game. Graphically, it's a bit of a strange one. I actually kind of like the backgrounds and the design of Greendog himself, but there's so many sprites that look like they should be in different games, either being way more cartoony or way more serious. It's hard to know if this was a deliberate choice or if they just didn't really care, but either way it does kind of have a charm to it. The controls here are fine. They are a little dodgy with the collision detection, mainly when you're trying to land on a platform and you fall through it when you really shouldn't have, but it's manageable. Overall, I do genuinely think that this game is actually quite fun. I know a lot of people hate on it, but I really can't see why. It's nowhere near the worst game on the system, and it does have awesome music, if a little repetitive. This was my first time playing it, and I did actually enjoy it. It's not the best game or anything, but it is a good way to kill an hour or so. So if you are one of those people that hates it, let me know why in the comments below. Is it for an actual reason, or is it just because the internet told you to? Here is Super Troll Islands for the SNES. Oh boy. It's based on those awesome troll toys with the funky hair that I genuinely really like and used to collect. The story here is that some bastard has taken all the colour from the Troll Islands, but thankfully just walking around brings the colour back. So you take control of a handful of trolls, each of which controls slightly differently, and you have to walk around the levels bringing the colour back. Now the main thing you want to do is climb any ladders, as filling these in and creating a square is your main objective and opens up the next level. The rest of the level is just a bonus. You literally do this by just walking around and climbing stuff. It's actually pretty cool seeing the levels get their colour back, but it doesn't mean it's good. Pretty soon you get puzzle elements like needing to push blocks around to create pathways and so on, and there's a ton of enemies in the levels too. These can be defeated by throwing stuff at them, and there's a lot of stuff you can throw. Or if you have a tornado power-up, you can use this to become invincible and spin through everyone and even avoid damage from spikes. Now, on paper, this doesn't actually sound too bad, but actually playing it is a different matter, mainly because everything is so damn fast. Your character moves at 100 miles an hour at all times, making controlling any of the trolls a pain in the ass. It is something you do get used to, but most of the time you'll run into enemies or spikes or any other hazards, as you've got no chance of seeing what's coming up. It means that you have to do that annoying thing where you sort of have to stop and start every few inches just so you can see what's coming up. There's no way to look up or down, so there's a lot of leaps of faith here, and you can probably guess that most of the time you'll end up down a hole or on spikes. You do get a few lives, and each one being represented by a different troll. Some are faster than others, or some can jump higher, but it doesn't really make a difference. Also, something that's kind of disturbing is that the way that the troll looks at you the whole time, no matter what. And to kill enemies, when you throw food at them to stun them, you then walk into them and eat them. That's right, you actually eat them. This means that your troll is just covering things like bats, frogs and snails in sugar and just eating them alive. Pretty sick. And you actually see him chewing on the enemies. This game is messed up. The graphics overall aren't particularly pleasing. They're kind of detailed, but they just look nasty. I can't tell what it is though. Maybe it's just the design of everything. Though I guess as much as I like the trolls, they aren't exactly nice to look at in the first place. Also, there's just so much going on the whole time. With text bouncing up and down and hundreds of things to collect that are flashing and spinning, this game just needs to calm the fuck down. This is not a good game, and I wouldn't recommend it. Socket for the Sega Mega Drive is about as unapologetic a rip-off of Sonic as you can get, but it is actually done pretty well. So you're Socket, a duck with a plug on his back, and you have to stop an evil doctor who's created a robot army. Sound familiar? At the start of every level, Socket is charged up, and you need to make it to the end of the level before you run out of power. So basically, the energy is your timer as well as health. It slowly drains over time, and also you have a few abilities you can use, mostly your kick attack, and these also use a bit of energy. And of course, if you hit an enemy, then you'll also lose a bit more energy as well. But don't worry, as there are little sparks throughout the level that you can collect that give you more energy, and also if you're lucky, you'll find a charge point to completely replenish it. The levels themselves are quite large and have a number of enemies that you'll need to kick to death. Thankfully, this does work well, and your attacks are effective. As Socket wants to be a hedgehog, he also moves really fast, and the levels are packed with hills and twists and turns, as well as springs that will bounce you all over the place, and boosters that you can use to get to top speed in just a few seconds. Actually getting around the levels is a lot of fun though, thanks to decent controls and the fact that there are a few routes you can take. I don't want to keep making comparisons, but these levels really do look like could be rejects from Sonic games. The graphics here are decent, with bright colours everywhere, and the characters look like you'd expect for the era. The music is very good as well, and the controls are very good, though it can be tough to make some jumps and avoid enemies thanks to the fast speed and momentum, which is kind of common in games like this really. Though for the most part, the game does focus more on open areas where you do want to go fast, but you've got to watch out for your energy as that will be constantly depleting, so make sure you get those sparks. Overall, this is another really fun game that is often overlooked, but will likely surprise you with how good it is, and it's well worth adding to the collection. And finally for today, here is Spirou for the Super Nintendo, or it might be pronounced Spyro, not entirely sure. You play as the titular Spirou, who is a concierge guy at an invention convention, which is fun to say. While you're there, some inventions get stolen, so you set out to get them back, along with your fox dog mate who tags along. Your adventure takes you through the usual platformer-style levels of streets, shops, trains and forests. What's cool is that each level tends to have a slightly different vibe, thanks to the inventions that have been stolen being used against you. For example, in the toy shop level, you've been shrunk down, so everything is huge, and you'll need to push toy blocks around to get around the level. There aren't too many enemies in the game, and for the most part you'll just be avoiding hazards that are in the levels, though you do often come across an evil thing and you can just jump on their heads to defeat them, and you get a decent bounce which can often get you to a new area. You can collect red hats on the levels and yep, get enough of these and you get an extra life, but that's about all there is to get. The levels mainly are just a case of getting to the end. I mentioned before that you have a little fox dog buddy, and he actually comes in quite handy, as if you watch what he does, you get hints as to how you need to get around the level. He'll be bouncing off certain things, climbing bits, or sliding under things. This is a nice touch, and it's done in a way that isn't really holding your hand, but gives you hints, and after a few levels, then you'll be using all these tricks you've learned anyway. The graphics here are very good, with a real cartoony look to it. I originally assumed that it might have been based on a cartoon or something, but apparently that's not the case as far as I can tell. The animation is great, and you get a few cutscenes between levels so you know what's going on, though they do drag on a bit, and I did tend to skip them most of the time, which probably won't shock most people. The controls here aren't perfect and are probably the worst thing about the game. You'll sometimes have trouble jumping on platforms, and especially when you have to climb things, as the collision detection isn't great, and you have to be in a very specific place in order to hold onto things. It is something you get used to, but doesn't always feel natural. But other than some control issues, this is a solid platform game that I've never even heard of, so I had no expectations when I was going in, but I was pleasantly surprised. This is another one worth a look. So there you go, 10 16-bit platform games that don't always get talked about. Which one is your favourite, and what other platform games don't often get talked about that are worth a look? Let us know in the comments below. Now, all that's left for me to say is thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.